So I guess we should start off by talking about this kind of breaking news about this deal. Is it even a deal? Is there a ceasefire in the works? Was it negotiated by Trump and Netanyahu? Tell us what happened, and then let's get into the why and how.
Well, I should maybe start my response to your question by saying there are a lot more reports than there are confirmed facts. So much of what I'm going to be saying is a little speculative. But there have been supposedly authoritative texts of an imminent ceasefire and captive exchange agreement floating around. They're being put out by Palestinians, by Israeli media, by various others, and they seem to be fairly consistent. And if these reports are correct, again, I preface that with saying if these reports are correct, then basically Israel and Hamas appear to be on the verge of reaching a three-stage agreement, which is virtually indistinguishable from the agreement that outgoing President Joe Biden presented, I believe it was in late May, and that he at the time said was an Israeli proposal. So then the question becomes, why is Israel now accepting a proposal that it has not accepted before now? And why is Hamas now accepting this proposal? In other words, what has changed? Well, if one listens, for example, to US officials, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and others, you're left with the impression that Israel has signed off on this agreement many months ago. And the real obstacle has been getting Hamas to provide its consent to this agreement and to its implementation. But in fact, as we've known from multiple sources, most recently today from Israel's National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, it is Israel that has consistently refused to finalize an agreement using various pretexts, which all come down to a determination to continue with the genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip and its various attacks in the West Bank and elsewhere in the region. What appears to have changed now is one simple thing, that Trump appears determined not to have to deal with a Middle East crisis, and particularly one that includes American hostages in the Middle East. If anyone remembers Jimmy Carter, on the day he enters the White House and wants this resolved. And according to Israeli press reports, his Middle East envoy, who I believe his name is Steve Witkoff, went to the Qatari capital, Doha, where the finalization of these negotiations is taking place. Basically came to the conclusion that there were elements on which Israel needed to give its consent and approval, flew to Tel Aviv, read the riot act to Netanyahu, and since then everyone has been talking about an imminent ceasefire and exchange agreement.
And can you elaborate on what you just said about Ben-Gvir? What was just revealed about him and the hostage negotiations?
Ben-Gvir today came out with a statement basically saying that on multiple occasions during the past year, he has personally intervened to make sure that no ceasefire agreement is reached. And essentially what he's saying is that at various stages, he has informed his prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, that if an agreement is signed, that Ben-Gvir will leave the governing coalition and the government will collapse. I think that's partially true because I think Ben-Gvir, perhaps for electoral purposes, is also trying to give the impression that Netanyahu has been willing at various stages to sign an agreement, but that it was only because of Ben-Gvir's intervention that such an agreement was not reached. Whereas I think it's been quite clear for many months that Netanyahu appears has been as uninterested in such an agreement as Ben-Gvir makes himself out to be. And of course, the other key issue is that it essentially took one visit and one firm conversation with Netanyahu to bring this agreement to the cusp of final agreement and implementation. Again, a big if, because nothing is certain yet, but it appears plausible that it's imminent. And I think what that reflects is that for at least the past 6 months, the outgoing U.S. administration, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, and the others, have not only made absolutely no effort to reach this agreement, but have made a conscious choice not to use any of the enormous leverage that the United States holds over Israel to bring this to an end. And the only explanation I can give for that is that they see Israel as serving an important U.S. strategic objective in the Middle East.
Yeah. I mean, it really begs the question of how tirelessly Biden was working, right? Which is the claim.
Well, he was working tirelessly. The question is, what was he working
doing what? Yes,
for?
exactly. So what was he working tirelessly for, would you say?
Well, I think to ensure that Israel received unconditional support, had full leeway to do as it pleases, was given the resources in terms of weaponry, armaments, vetoes at the UN Security Council, and so on, so that it could act without restraint in the Middle East. And I think, and this maybe relates more to Blinken than Biden, also that Israel was free to violate not only international law and the laws of war, but also U.S. domestic legislation, because we have the scandal of Blinken knowingly signing off on that Israeli conduct was consistent with U.S. legislation when he had been explicitly informed that it was in violation of those laws.
Right. And, it's interesting because regardless of what happened, to some extent, regardless of what happened, I think it's significant that Ben-Gvir did, right? Unless he's just bragging, but it seems pretty clear that he got in the way of the hostage negotiations, right? This is someone who stood in the way of releasing Jewish hostages. And, Israel has one job, it claims, right? Which is to keep Jews safe and be a safe haven for the Jewish people. We all know that's not true on many levels. And you and I have spoken about this, and I've spoken about it with Yaakov Shapiro, our second guest. But this is a pretty explicit example of it. And it also, though, reveals something about Biden and every single person who has been saying throughout the past year, over a year, has been saying that Hamas was the obstacle. So let's take a look at this Ben-Gvir video.
אני קורא לחברי, השר בצלאל סמוטריץ', לחבור אליי וביחד לשתף פעולה נגד העסקה המתרקמת. לעוצמה יהודית אין את הכוח למנוע את העסקה לבד. אבל ביחד אנחנו יכולים ללכת לראש הממשלה ולהודיע לו שאם הוא מעביר את העסקה, אנחנו פורשים מהממשלה. אני מדגיש, גם אם נהיה באופוזיציה לא נפיל את נתניהו. אבל השיתוף פעולה הזה זו הדרך היחידה שלנו למנוע את עסקת הכניעה, למנוע את העסקה הנוראית הזאת, ולדאוג לכך שמותם של מאות חיילים לא יהיה לשווא.
So, given what he just said there and his admission that he thwarted negotiations, what does that mean about what the Biden administration, people like Antony Blinken, have been saying when they constantly repeat the refrain that Hamas was the one in the way of these negotiations?
Well, they've known what's been going on. They've known precisely what's been going on all along. I mean, you and I knew it. How could they possibly not have known it? They knew this all along, and they made a deliberate choice to cover it up, to market a false narrative, brazen lies, not only to the American public, but globally. And, if their purpose was to bring this genocidal campaign to an end, if their purpose was a ceasefire agreement, if their purpose was an Israeli-Palestinian exchange of hostages and captives and prisoners, they would have found a way to tell the truth that would not have offended at least their own sensibilities and so on. But they deliberately chose to lie, and to lie repeatedly. And their motive, I think, was that they shared the Israeli government's agenda of prolonging and expanding this war at the expense, certainly, of tens of thousands of Palestinian lives and many Lebanese and Syrian and other lives, but also at the expense of the lives of perhaps dozens of Israeli captives and hostages who were being held in the Gaza Strip. It's an absolutely cynical approach, but that's often the case with foreign policy, particularly by a superpower.
Right. And so can you elaborate on what you think the perceived strategic interests are for the United States that would make the United States so shamelessly and unwaveringly support our special friend Israel?
Well, this, I think, goes really back to the Cold War and the aftermath of the 1967 June War, where Israel demonstrated with its overwhelming military victory over multiple Arab states that it was capable of essentially transforming the strategic equation in the Middle East to the advantage of Washington and to the disadvantage of the Soviet Union. That all kind of began to change during the 90s with the end of the Cold War. You may remember the Kuwait crisis in 1990-91, where rather than relying on Israeli military power to achieve its objectives against Iraq, the United States went to extraordinary lengths to keep Israel on the sidelines and out of that conflict, so that the coalition of Arab states it had composed would stay together. And I think the low point from that perspective was October 7th, where Israel, which is supposed to be the regional proxy for US power, all of a sudden needed all kinds of US assistance, direct and indirect. But I think what changed over the course of the summer of last year was that Israel, which had really been knocked off balance on October 7th, and whose initial response over certainly the first several months seemed to be defined primarily by bloodlust and revenge rather than any strategic vision, began to take the initiative to seek to once again transform the strategic equation in the Middle East, not only in the Gaza Strip, but decapitating Hezbollah in Lebanon, taking credit for the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, although there I think Israel's role was more of a contributing than primary factor, directly attacking Iran on several occasions, and once again kind of being the bull in the china shop that can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, to whoever it wants, with complete and total impunity, thereby once again demonstrating its strategic value to the United States in the Middle East.
And how do you think this contrasts, or maybe doesn't, but how would you compare this to Trump's, I don't even want to say ideology or vision, because I think that implies an ideological commitment that he doesn't have. But how much of this is just pure opportunism on Trump's part?
Well, I think the difference between Biden and Trump is that Biden has this passionate attachment to Israel. He's fanatically devoted to it, has been throughout his career for multiple reasons. Trump, may have taken some extreme pro-Israel decisions, but unlike Biden, I don't think this is someone who gives a hoot for either Israel or the Palestinians, or for that matter, anyone else, and looks at it through much more narrow perspective. What's in it for him? What's in it for the United States? And it's very much a cold, calculated cost-benefit calculation. And that's why, for example, in his first term, he got massive support from the Adelsons and so on, and that translated into moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and several other decisions he took. I think now his priority, given the diversity of his constituency, there seem to be fewer neocons and Uberhawks in his coalition. There seem to be more, let's say, isolationists and anti-war types. I think his priority is not to get the United States involved in another land war in the Middle East, particularly one that involves Iran, that would make Iraq and Afghanistan look like child's play. He, according to people much better versed in Trump than I ever care to be, he seems to have an agenda that is primarily domestic, that is primarily focused on extracting revenge against all his real and perceived enemies, that is focused on hostility towards immigrants and so on. And he doesn't want to be distracted by, you know, Israel's conflicts, if you will, in the Middle East. And I think the big question that we need to look at in the coming months is not so much the US-Israeli relationship, but rather the US-Saudi relationship. Will the Saudis persuade Trump to ditch this idea of a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement and to instead limit it to a bilateral US-Saudi agreement where the US delivers a nuclear program and a formal security guarantee to Saudi Arabia, and in return Saudi Arabia pledges to buy tens of billions of dollars in US weapons, reduces its relations with China and so on? Or alternatively, will the Saudis go to Trump and say, look, we want to do this normalization deal, but only if you can force Israel to do 1, 2, and 3. And that's something that would be, I think, inconceivable under Biden, but is certainly possible under Trump. I'm not saying it's going to happen or that it's even likely, but it's at least within the realm of possibility.